Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Frankmusik, titled For You. I gotta be honest folks, I've really been looking forward to this one. See, I think it was more coincidence than anything else that I decided to pick up Frankmusik's 2014 album By Nicole, figuring there was bound to be some quality there given that I had heard his work with Colette Carr. What I didn't expect was tightly written, explosive synth pop backed up by the impressively raw vocals of Vincent Frank. Whereas pop music was getting more polished and reserved, he was doubling down on intense passion, which could get a little bit awkward considering that album was, for all intents and purposes, a breakup album. Because believe me, when By Nicole worked, we got killer songs like Misdemeanor and Uh-Oh and These Streets and Call to Arms and Conclusions, the last two being some of my favorite songs of 2014, but as a whole, By Nicole felt a little bit too overwrought for the material that I was trying to tackle and could afford a little bit more subtlety to undercut some of that bitterness. But that being said, even despite the flaws, By Nicole hit enough high points that when I heard Frankmusik's new album For You was grounded in more contentment, pitching all the bitterness and grief to the winds, I was definitely interested. After all, Call to Arms is probably the simplest song on that album in terms of being a raw, straightforward pump-up song, but it was also the best song on By Nicole. If he could throw together a pop album of tracks just like that, he'd have a smash hit on his hands. So I have to admit, I had a lot of high hopes for this album, and some pretty high expectations. So, did For You deliver? Well, this is a tricky album for me to review, because it's very clear across the board that Frankmusik configured For You as a spacious, impeccably modern electronic synth pop record, built to the brim with straightforward, heartfelt love songs, and at its best, it's got an exhilarating quality that perfectly fits that high-energy dance where you can slot in nearly every song off of this album. The production is better, the energy is brighter, the lyrics don't succumb to the bitterness that hurt By Nicole. By all accounts, this record is a more cohesive work, and yet I'm not quite sure it's better than By Nicole. Or if it is, it's only by the slightest margin. And look, something might be a factor of this year, being overloaded with fantastic synth pop as it is. He's facing much stiffer competition, and while this record definitely holds its own, Churches, The Wombats, and Lower Dens, that's an impressive trio to beat. And while this album is very good, I'm not quite certain it's up to that level. But then again, I'm not even sure if that's the main competition here, because where By Nicole took its maximalist leanings to intensify his emotional turmoil, For You aims for the dance floor, maybe even the festival circuit, with the sweeping tones and the instrumental breakdowns that epitomize that format. And you know what? That's pretty impressive, given that Frankmusik wrote and produced the entire thing himself without the benefit of major label production money, that he can still make the album sound this big and have some real depth to it. That's impressive. Now, I'm not gonna say all the horns and the strings sound as crisply organic as the real thing, and like most Frankmusik albums, it can feel a little bit over-mixed and cluttered for its own damn good. Why he adds in those warbling vocal flutters on I Remember or Majestic is just beyond me. Unless they contribute to the melody like the careening sparks on Love Again, they just really overload things. But then again, this guy has always had a knack for taking solid melodic progressions and just blowing them up to titanic size against windswept, airy production. Love Again is the first real example on this album that really clicks for me. Probably the most modern song here too. That takes a progression you'd otherwise hear on a Dylan Francis trap album, and not only makes it more complex, but then blows up the energy and the tempo into the stratosphere. So much of this is anchored off of balancing that melodic groove. And when this album really hits its stride in the back half with songs like The Subtle Show, the great chorus on Never Left, fantastic hook there, the piano supporting Say Goodbye, and especially that change in intensity midway through Know My Name, he really gets something special. Now, there are some moments that fall into a similar vein as Churches, especially the 80s inspired Turnin', which really is a great song too, but Frankmusik is aiming for greater bombast than Churches, like the opulence of Lexus or the strings behind Show or Never Left, or even the hints of horns that creep through, especially on Mistress. And then there's the album closer, This, which ranks as one of his best ever songs simply because of the focus power that Sandy X crystallizing for massive impact. It's an epic song, really do love that track. Now that said, this album's not all great here in the production. Both the album opener, Wake Up, and the chorus of Lexus force the dissonance in the melodies a little bit too hard for their own damn good on their synths, to make some otherwise decent tracks feel a little bit more askew and clumsy than they should be. And make no mistake, when this album cannot build a melodic groove, the lumbering, heavy beats are plenty content to just hammer it into you, which could work if this album was gunning for more aggressive emotions. It does work well on this, but it can feel a little bit out of place at points, especially on Mistress, which seems to be going for a little bit more grandeur, that's a little bit more overstated and more theatrical, not so much pummeling. And as I said, the overmixed nature of the production can work against Frankmusik, especially on the slower, more restrained sex tracks like Ground or Somewhere, where it undercuts some otherwise pretty pretty damn great atmosphere with some of the more tasteful usages of reverb that I've heard in a long time, especially for these pseudo R&B tracks. And of course, pitch-shifted vocals find their way onto this album, of course they do, especially on Sometimes, and they don't really sound that great. I think he overmixes some of these tracks to his detriment. Now this takes us to Frankmusic's delivery, and let me stress, this guy is a vocal powerhouse, and he knows his own range impressively well. More importantly, he knows how to produce for his voice, and his layering and multi-tracking can prove pretty damn effective, especially when he brings in his upper register and a really good falsetto. I guess if I were to nitpick a little here, I miss some of the throatier, lower range vocals that he brought in on Cole's most powerful tracks, if only because he's such a force of unique personality in that range. But overall, when he sounds better than ever on the rest of his register, I'm not really gonna complain much here. And this takes to the area where I actually have the least to say. Lyrics and themes. Quite simply, if Cole was the bitter breakup album, this is Frankmusik learning to trust and love again before returning to the spotlight, and a pop scene that might have left him behind, but he's gonna find his way regardless. As such, with few exceptions, most of this record are fairly straightforward love songs with differences in tone, but I do appreciate that there is a progression from liking the glamour and the idea of the relationship to being a little bit bemused and surprised that it's there, to something a little bit deeper as he learns to give him himself and really appreciate it on a deeper level. Of course, for all those great love songs that go to the stars and back, the album has to start on the sour attitudes left behind from Cole, which is one of the reasons that Wake Up is such a bitter note to open up this album. Really not a great opener. Yeah, I get its place to begin the progression, but I'd argue the album could have started on a note that didn't feel so actively abrasive, even if that was the point, even that there was that distrust there. The other criticism that I could make is that the lyrical arc is a little bit light on the drama compared to the complicated emotional turmoil of Cole that had so much power, but you know what? I actually appreciate the simplicity and subtlety of the arc here. And you really feel the emotional relief that he feels as this album approaches his absolutely excellent final third, and it really reaches that emotional payoff, that high. So yeah, for the most part, I really like this album, even if it's a shade shy from really loving it. I still think that Frankmusik could afford to give his tracks a little bit more room to breathe, and I'd love to hear what he was able to do if he could push for more live instrumentation, but with what he's got, for you might start off a little shaky, but it builds into a selection of damn great synth pop tracks that ride on great grooves, huge choruses, and moods that are downright infectious. For me, an exceptionally strong 7 out of 10 and a very high recommendation. And while I'm not quite sure it hits the killer moments of drama on Cole, 4U gives this Frankmusik fresh, revitalized, and very much back on track. And believe me, I can't wait to hear more. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Now for that special announcement for you all. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times in a couple of videos, I am actually a writer on the side. I've been publishing a couple short story anthologies, and if you Google my name on Amazon, you'd probably find them. Go check them out. The anthologies, I'm really proud of them. They got some other great stories from other authors. Definitely worth your time. But you know, there's something that's always eluded me before now. And now it's time for that special announcement that I put up on Twitter. On October 24th, I'm going to be releasing my first ever full-length novel on Amazon. Fantasy-inspired novel, and it's called To Kill a Dragon. I'd go into more details, but I think we're out of time. So keep watching the videos. I'm going to be slowly revealing more about the novel up until its release date. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.